Influence is defined as the capacity or power of a person or thing to be a compelling force on or produce effects on the actions, behaviors, and opinions of others. In the world of stand-up comedy, influence would certainly be embodied by the comedians we have seen historically who have shifted and impacted the craft in a meaningful way, and have moved it towards the current state we all see right now, for better or for worse. Some of these comedians had a massive impact on stand-up comedy in the primes of their career decades ago, while some of them are still actively working today and continuing to be a dominant and influential force in today's comedy landscape. From legendary comedians of the previous century such as Richard Pryor and George Carlin to more modern comedians like Dave Chappelle or Louis C.K., stand-up comedy has changed a lot since its early inception as an outlet of entertainment. It's extremely hard for me to accurately rank what comedians have had the biggest impact over the last century, since I've only been alive the last 24 years, but I am going to do my absolute best to give flowers to the people I think have had the biggest impact on comedy as a whole. I originally wanted this video to be a top 10 list, but I realized when I was making the list that I needed more than 10 spots, so I changed it to a top 15 list. Making this list, as well as my previous top 10 greatest comedians of all time list, is like splitting hairs, but I think this one has a lot more objectivity to it than who everybody's favorite comedian is. Even though not everyone finds Lenny Bruce to be a hilarious stand-up comic, I think it's pretty universally accepted by comedy fans that he influenced the course of comedy a lot in the 20th century. I'll be ranking these comedians by the impact they had as a comedian in their era and describing how it is they influenced other comedians. Without further ado, this is the top 15 most influential comedians of all time. Starting off with an honorable mention, we have Mitch Hedberg. Sweet, sweet Mitch. I used to love Mitch Hedberg. I still do, but I used to too. Mitch Hedberg had a seriously great run as a comedian that would go on to influence a lot of young, up-and-coming comedians. His addictive one-liner style of comedy, followed by his very strange pattern of speech, made him an enigma in the world of comedy. He started stand-up comedy in 1989 while living in Florida, and after many years of working his ass off, he appeared on an MTV show called Kamikaze, and then shortly thereafter made his late-night television debut on Late Show with David Letterman, and almost immediately, he developed a cult following for his addictive style of comedy. Now, of course, there were other types of one-liner comedians like Rodney Dangerfield and Stephen Wright, who also influenced the genre of comedy massively with their styles, but there was something different about Mitch Hedberg's delivery that was so original, silly, and likable. Mitch was one of the first comedians to really popularize the comedic act of filling your act almost entirely with non-sequitur jokes, which gave it that sort of out-of-left-field, almost shower thoughts type of feeling whenever you listen to his act. It's easily apparent when you watch a little bit of his stand-up comedy for yourself.
I like an escalator, man, because an escalator can never break. It can only become stairs. Yeah? You know, on a traffic light, green means go and yellow means yield, but on a banana, it's just the opposite. Green means hold on. Yellow means go ahead. And red means where did you get that banana at?
Not only is his style incredibly simple and unique, but he receives almost endless praise from his peers and younger comedians as a genius. In this clip, Bill Burr talks with Joe Rogan about Mitch Hedberg and talks about just how amazing of a comic he really was.
He was brilliant.
Oh my God, it's
Brilliant.
so fucking original. I mean, you just sat there and you just became a fan. First time I saw him was in the old Largo on Fairfax. He was just one of those guys. I don't care if you had fucking 12 beers in you. You just knew instantly, I am watching a genius.
Yeah.
And you would just, it was, yeah, man. That's still.
He was so original.
There's also a bunch of other comedians who talk endlessly about how much of an influence Mitch Hedberg has had that you can find for yourself. Even the late great George Carlin has gone on the record to say how much he respects and admires Mitch Hedberg and his style of comedy.
What makes you laugh?
Well, I still love, of course, the people who are timeless and tested. Steve Martin, Lily Tomlin, Woody Allen, and among people who are less known but somewhat known, Mitch Hedberg. I like because of the odd left field nature of his brain. He's kind of like a Stephen Wright with a little something extra going on. And I love Stephen Wright.
I also heard this really funny story from Artie Lang about Mitch Hedberg and Norm Macdonald that I thought was hysterical. A great story from Artie. How the fuck did Artie outlive Mitch Hedberg and Norm Macdonald? Anyway, Mitch has been cited a lot as a favorite and an influence of younger comedians, so I felt he deserved a spot on this list, even though his life was tragically cut short at just 37 years old. I strongly believe that if Mitch had stayed alive and kept doing stand-up comedy, he would have certainly became even more legendary in the world of stand-up. Because he died so young, I gave him an honorable mention spot, but I don't think he exceeds anyone else above him on the list. All the respect and the love in the world for Mitch Hedberg, and may he rest in peace. Long live Mitch Hedberg.
I'm out for presidents to represent me. I'm out for presidents to represent me.
At number 15, we have Dave Chappelle. Some people are going to be mad that Dave Chappelle is only number 15 on this list, but I promise it will make sense as the list continues to unfold. Dave Chappelle is a hell of a stand-up comedian who has been an inspiration to an entire generation of new comedians for many different reasons. One of the first reasons that comes to mind is the fact that he made arguably the greatest sketch show of all time on Comedy Central's Chappelle Show, which has aired some of the greatest sketches in sketch comedy history. This undoubtedly inspired other great sketch shows like Key and Peele, as well as Gillian Keeves. Not only that, but when he was pressured by Comedy Central and he felt like he was being pimped and taken advantage of, he walked away from a $50 million offer and away from show business as a whole for a long time. This showed that not only was Dave undeniably funny as a comedian and sketch comic, but he also had his integrity in check and likely inspired a lot of other artists going through the same thing to stand up for themselves when selling their products to networks. Dave's stand-up also speaks for itself. In 2000, he released Killin' Them Softly, which is often considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest comedy special of all time by many comedians and comedy fans alike. It's neck and neck with Skanks for the Memories by Dave Attell, but if you picked one over the other, I would not be upset about it. Even as Dave has aged, he has continued to do his own thing. He lives in Yellow Springs, Ohio, away from all the Hollywood bullshit, and he even opened up his own comedy club over there, which our friends over at Joke World did some really excellent coverage of. I know Dave is still involved somewhat given all the Netflix deals he has received over the years, and the fact that he has appeared on Saturday Night Live 4 times over the last decade, but I do think he has a level of independence in his artistic direction that is admirable for anyone that is an up-and-coming artist who looks up to him. So many comedians have cited Dave as an influence of theirs and an inspiration that his influence in the world of comedy pretty much speaks for itself. A few examples of people who've cited Dave as an influence are Shane Gillis, Mark Normand, Chris Rock, and many others. Dave himself also cites several other comedians on this list as an influence of his, and you'll find out who that is soon enough. Dave has also been a recipient of the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor, which further solidified the comedic legacy and influence Dave has carried for nearly 4 decades. I think I'm going to leave it here for Dave, and even though I think his older stand-up comedy is funnier than his newer work, I always look forward to hearing what Dave releases next, even if he is just a little bit too fixated on trans people for my liking. All of this and more is why I ranked Dave at the number 15 spot. Long live Dave Chappelle. At number 14, we have Joan Rivers. Now, I know my audience, and I'm sure several of you are racing down to the comments to reference one of my favorite Norm Macdonald clips.
Yeah, I'm not going to guide any lady through comedy. That would take me, first of all, I'd have to figure out how a lady could do comedy.
But I think that Joan Rivers deserves her respect and flowers for just how much of a comedic powerhouse she has been in her lifetime. She had a very blunt yet satirical style of comedy, almost like a grandmother who stopped giving a shit years ago and just tells you exactly what she feels, even if it hurts your feelings.
So we go swimming with sharks. I swear, I'm Jewish. It is so ridiculous. And you swim with sharks. I was so scared. I stood next to the fattest woman and I said, I hope you have your period. Because that...
She even has an interview where she talks about a Holocaust joke she made and that she refused to publicly apologize for it, even though some others felt it was too offensive. This style of blunt, honest comedy is why she's often brought up in the same conversations as comedians like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, or Eddie Murphy. She was one of the first female comedians to really break through into the mainstream and limelight, and not just because she was a woman who was propped up in his success, but because she was legitimately funny and ruthless when she was performing performing comedy on stage. She's also influenced many comedians such as Roseanne Barr, Sarah Silverman, Jessica Kirson, Louis C.K., and many more. I first got into her when I saw her episode on Louis C.K.'s TV show Louis, where Louis films a brief few minutes of her set while laughing hysterically. This made me realize just how talented she was. Not only did she pave the way for female comedians, but she also had a late-night television show called The Late Show starring Joan Rivers, which acted as a stepping stool for many up-and-coming comedians at the time. This was actually where comedian Chris Rock would make his television debut in New York City. She also had on many other great guests such as Pee Wee Herman and the Beastie Boys, and plenty more where that came from. Even after she stopped doing her show, she had a successful stand-up career far later into her life. One of my favorite clips of Joan Rivers is her handling a heckler in Wisconsin. I highly recommend you check this out for yourself. It just shows how badass this woman really was. Then, when Joan Rivers died, people spoke at her funeral and talked about how important and amazing of a woman and comedian she was, such as Howard Stern, Louis C.K., and just about all the yammering bitches from The View. Don't hold that against her, I was just trying to be silly. In all seriousness, she had a profound impact on the world of comedy, and I can't talk about her as endlessly as I could Dave Chappelle or Norm Macdonald, but she deserves her flowers, and I think she disproves the notion that women can't be funny by a huge margin, which is why I ranked her at number 14 on my list. Long live Joan Rivers. At number 13, we have the great Richard Jeni. Richard is a comedian that is often glossed over by other comics, but in his time alive, he was easily one of the best comedians working, and he certainly had an influence over many great comedians working today. When it came to boiling down a premise into a full bit, there was nobody that could do it quite like Richard Jeni. He really had a unique writing style that covered every nook, cranny, and angle he could possibly think of. A lot of comedians compared his style to wringing a towel and extracting every molecule and every drop of funniness possible out of it. One of the best bits from Richard that I think demonstrates this perfectly is his bit about breakups and relationships. The fact that he took one funny thought and turned it into multiple act-outs, lines, and angles, it really shows how talented of a writer he was. This was also during a period when witty one-liner comedians like Rodney Dangerfield and Stephen Wright really had a dominance in the comedy landscape. They seemed to be riding a wave of popularity, so it was refreshing to have other comedians like Richard who could milk a topic for all that it's worth. A lot of comedians cite Richard Jeni as an influence like Jim Carrey, Jay Leno, Joe Rogan, Bill Maher, and more. Richard Jeni was also ranked number 57 on Comedy Central's list of the 100 greatest stand-up comedians of all time. I think one of the reasons Richard is glossed over a lot of the time is because he wasn't always necessarily held in high regard by his peers. He was known for being a bit of an asshole to some people, especially those who were closer to him in his life. Unfortunately, Richard was also mentally ill, as are a lot of other famous comedians, but it would lead to him taking his own life. Even in his short reign as a comedian, I really think he had a sizable impact on the world of comedy and influenced a lot of comedians working today. He emphasized delivery, but also the importance of writing, and more writing. This, among many other things, is why I ranked him as number 13 on the list. Long live Richard Jeni.
Do you like violence? Wanna see me stick 9-inch nails to each one of my eyelids?
At number 12, we have Andy Kaufman. This is a very controversial choice on my end, and I acknowledge that. Andy Kaufman was the original troll in the world of comedy. He had a strong disdain for the traditional way of comedy, which was set up, punchline, joke, hoo-ha, the whole world works. Andy was an agent of chaos in his own way, and often did things that were highly unconventional, and he carved his own unique path through the world of comedy by being unique to himself and not obeying the traditional norms often expected from stand-up comedians. Even though he is listed as an entertainer and not a comedian, and he himself even said he never considered himself a comic, I'm including him anyway because he kind of split the atom in a sense in the world of entertainment. Before him, even counterculture comedians like George Carlin still obeyed the setup punchline format often followed in the realm of entertainment and comedy. However, Andy's only promise is that doing whatever he wanted, he would try his best to entertain the audience, not necessarily tell a joke and make them laugh. In his own words, he never told a joke and never called himself a comic once. Despite going in a different direction than other entertainers and comedians, he ended up being a regular guest on Late Night with David Letterman and often did sketch comedy on the show. Andy Kaufman's incredibly obscure antics influenced the genre of comedy by encouraging people to be true to themselves and not always obeying the expectations of the audience in front of them. His subversive nature certainly inspired the likes of Anthony Jeselnik, Norm Macdonald to some degree, Jim Carrey, and many more comedians where that came from. He also influenced sketch comedy on many different comedy shows. Even though he's not a comic and he's never told a joke, as by his own admission, I still think Andy Kaufman is one of the most influential entertainers of all time, and I want to give him his flowers. Even though he's not one of the funniest people on the planet to me, and I would probably never even put him in my top 20, I still think it's worth acknowledging the impact he had on a long list of comedians who came after him. The next person on the list certainly had a little bit of Andy Kaufman in him. All of this and more is why I ranked Andy Kaufman number 12. Long live Andy Kaufman.
Too bad that you had to get caught. That's not like you to lose face.
At number 11, we have Norm Macdonald. Now, you guys know I could talk for hours and hours about Norm Macdonald and how much of a comedy legend he is. In fact, I've already done that on my channel if you want to check out some more of that content after this video. However, Norm Macdonald is universally respected and acknowledged as a comedy genius by just about every comedian on the planet. His stand-up comedy is incredibly influential, but before that, let's talk about his time on television. His time on Saturday Night Live was when he really had the most eyes on him and what really propelled him forward into the limelight. On SNL, Norm's bread and butter was Weekend Update. The dry and sarcastic delivery he brought to the role just seemed to really hit with people, and he seemed like the perfect guy for the gig.
Finally, folks, next week, Jews everywhere will be celebrating the holiday of Yom Kippur, or as non-Jews refer to it, Wednesday.
Not everyone found Norm funny, but he always believed in his jokes on the show, which is one of the key factors that made him such a great comedian. He undoubtedly influenced many more Weekend Update hosts to come after him and really set a gold standard. Furthermore, Norm's stand-up comedy was a goldmine of observational comedy delivered in a sort of dark and twisted way. Louis C.K. has an entire foreword in Norm's book where he talks about how funny Norm is and how he really believed Norm's delivery was the best in the world. He also talks about how Norm is categorically an enigma because there's really no other comedian like him. Norm has influenced some of the best comedians working today, such as Shane Gillis, Mark Normand, and Anthony Jeselnik, and he's also influenced comedy legends like Adam Sandler, Kevin Nealon, Dave Chappelle, and David Letterman. There's also an interview of George Carlin praising Norm Macdonald that I found very interesting.
Norm Macdonald, for instance, forget the sitcom, forget the news on Saturday Night Live, but his stand-up, well, again, what kind of a strange left field thing, and that appeals to me. Those are the ones I think of when I answer the question. Right?
So aside from SNL and the sitcom, George Carlin really admired Norm Macdonald and thought he was a comedic genius. That's arguably the most influential comedian of all time, and one of the most respected comedians to ever walk the face of the earth, giving Norm his flowers. I think that just goes to show how influential Norm really was for comedy as a whole. He was also a person who genuinely wanted the best for his friends and treated so many people kindly. Like when Shane Gillis got fired from SNL, Norm immediately got in contact with him and consoled him. Norm is the perfect person given the fact that he got fired from SNL because he refused to throw Jim Downey under the bus, and then he told everybody he didn't know why they fired him. Until Jim Downey told the story on Conan's podcast, we had no idea what actually happened, and a lot of us thought it was for the OJ jokes he was fired. Norm took this secret that made him look incredibly good to the grave. That's fucking integrity right there. He did so much, and there's endless clip after clip after clip you can find of comedians praising Norm and saying just how influential and impactful he was as a comedian. I know a lot of you guys are going to think he deserves to be lower on the list and ranked closer to number 1, but I'm asking you to trust me here and understand why I put Norm above every single comedian I'm about to name on this list. I'm going to quit while I'm ahead here, but all of this and more is why I ranked Norm number 11. Long live the GOAT, Norm Macdonald.
Get up off of that thing and stand to do you better.
At number 10, we have Eddie Murphy. Now, Eddie Murphy is influential in film and comedy, but before he became a movie star, he was one of the most popular comedians in the world and still holds the highest grossing comedy special of all time. Eddie is the comedian who became bigger than comedy itself at a certain point, but in his prime, he had the potential to be the greatest comedian of all time. Some people even consider him the greatest of all time. When Eddie started working, he was naturally a very funny guy, and through classical training and experience, he realized he could do impressions, write excellent jokes, and also deliver material with unwavering confidence and excellent timing. He started stand-up before he turned 18, and by the time he was in his mid-20s, he was a fucking beast on stage. Eventually, he released Delirious, which was a huge success. Then later on, he released Raw, which was not as good objectively as Delirious, but it became the biggest comedy special of all time because of the anticipation built by Delirious. His comedic acting chops were great too, and he realized that he was making a lot more money doing that than stand-up comedy on the road, so eventually he just stopped working as a comedian and became a full-time actor and director. At this point, Eddie was a once-in-a-generation talent in the flesh, and he was rich now, so he really never had to pick up a microphone again if he didn't want to. He was also hugely successful on Saturday Night Live in his time on the show, and I firmly believe that if he wasn't there for the seasons that he was, the show probably would have failed. Eddie influenced so many comedians, it's actually insane. He's cited as an influence by many great comics such as Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, Norm Macdonald, Bill Burr, Patrice O'Neal, and many more. Even though he ended up stopping stand-up comedy super early on in his career, he still had a profound impact on the comedy universe and inspired some of the greatest comedians of all time early on in their careers. Without Eddie Murphy, comedy certainly would not be the same, which is why I ranked him at number 10 on the list. Long live Eddie Murphy.
Some folks are born made to wave the flag. Ooh, they're red, white, and
At number 9, we have Johnny Carson. A list of this magnitude simply does not feel complete without the late, great Johnny Carson. His stand-up comedy might not have been as impactful as somebody like George Carlin or Eddie Murphy, but Johnny Carson's late-night reign in the 20th century was something extraordinary, almost like he reinvented the wheel on television. He inspired the next generation of late-night television hosts and really helped them mold their styles. People like Conan O'Brien, David Letterman, Jay Leno, and Jon Stewart. For Johnny Carson, it started with The Johnny Carson Show, and eventually he had a long reign hosting The Tonight Show. He even inspired the likes of Joan Rivers and John Davidson to start their own talk shows, which Johnny perceived as disloyalty and led to him never speaking to either of them ever again. Jeez, a bit harsh, don't you think, Johnny? Eventually, Johnny Carson retired from show business at the age of 66 in 1962, but by then he had already cemented himself as a dominant force in the culture of comedy and one of the grandfathers of late-night television. He platformed the likes of Robin Williams, George Carlin, David Letterman, and so many more comedians that he basically for a while had the gateway to success in show business. The Tonight Show has a legacy to it that even in today's modern age of comedy, where you don't need TV anymore, still rings a loud bell. As cringe as it might sound to some people, nowadays Joe Rogan's podcast and Kill Tony are what The Tonight Show was in the mid-20th century. But even if you have success online and don't need The Tonight Show to sell tickets as a comedian, the legacy behind it is still extraordinary, and a large part of that is because of the many years of greatness demonstrated by Johnny. Not to mention the years of greatness that followed Johnny with Jay Leno, Conan, and then Jimmy Fallon. You couldn't pay me to watch The Tonight Show nowadays, but I still tune in every now and then when some of my friends are on because being on The Tonight Show is a super exciting opportunity. Johnny undoubtedly paved the way for all the late night show hosts we see today, and without him, we might have never seen television evolve the way it had in the world of comedy, which is why I rank him at number 9 on my list, even if I didn't find him funnier than Conan or David Letterman. All of this and more is why I ranked Johnny the way that I did. Long live Johnny Carson. At number 8, we have Stephen Wright. Stephen Wright has an incredibly unique style of comedy, and similar to other one-liner comedians with strong material, is very addicting to watch.
So I get off the plane and I forgot to undo my seatbelt, and I'm pulling the plane through the terminal. And the wings are knocking people over. And then I almost broke both my arms trying to hold open a revolving door for a woman.
The style is often emulated by younger comedians because of the powerful simplicity demonstrated by it. Stephen Wright's style is simple, but it's also incredibly complicated. To pull off what he does, he utilizes an incredibly dry and deadpan delivery, but what makes it stand out is his incredibly well-written material. A lot of Stephen Wright's jokes are borderline brilliant, and then some of them are just flat-out genius. A lot of his jokes could fit on a fortune cookie, and his dry delivery just really amplifies how excellent the joke writing is.
I like, because of the odd left field nature of his brain, he's kind of like a Stephen Wright with a little something extra going on, and I love Stephen Wright.
A lot of comedians who try to emulate Stephen Wright's style struggle with it because for most people, it takes many years of writing jokes to be able to nail the level of brevity Stephen demonstrates. That being said though, he inspired many one-liner or jokey joke types of comedians we see working today like Dave Attell, Mark Norman, Anthony Jeselnik, and many others. Whereas someone like Rodney Dangerfield or Mitch Hedberg had a little bit more animation and character in their style, Stephen Wright's delivery was completely stripped of any character and animation and remains dry throughout the entire delivery. Stephen Wright cited Woody Allen and George Carlin as his own biggest comedic influences, which is very interesting because his style is not really anything like either of them. Stephen first made a name for himself in comedy clubs with his style, and then eventually made appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where the natural obscurity he demonstrated in his act really caught the attention of a lot of people. He eventually got to a point where he was successful without stand-up comedy, but he definitely made his mark during his active years, and nowadays he does just about whatever the hell he wants. In 1985, he recorded a comedy album titled I Have a Pony, which comedy fans absolutely loved, and then 23 years later, he recorded his only other comedy album titled I Still Have a Pony, which was also very well received by his fan base. Even despite his inactivity when compared to other comedians, Stephen Wright's style of comedy certainly is unique and showed that you don't necessarily have to be animated or high energy to stand out, which is why his style is emulated by many comedians working today. Even though he isn't nearly as active as any of the other comedians on the list, he still has a well-deserved spot at number 8 on my list. I hope he stays healthy in his old age. Long live Stephen Wright. At number 7, we have Dave Attell. Dave Attell is arguably the funniest comedian on the planet right now. I would put him and Louis C.K. at the top of my list of the 2 best comedians we have right now. Even though Dave Attell hasn't seen the mainstream success someone like Bill Burr or Shane Gillis has, he still has a huge influence in the world of stand-up comedy nowadays. At one point, every single comedian in New York City, the best city for live stand-up comedy by the way, has emulated or admired Dave Attell. There's actually a clip of Anthony Jeselnik talking about how early on in his career he sounded a lot like Dave Attell, and he also shares a story of how the booker of the Comedy Cellar made a comment about how too many comedians in New York City are trying to emulate Dave Attell.
I did that with Dave Attell in New York.
Everybody did Attell.
I would run downstairs and watch Attell set, and then one day I caught myself not doing one of his bits, but like one of his mannerism kind of things.
Yeah.
It's just fun to do. And I was like, I got to stop this. And I went and told Esty, the woman who books the Comedy Cellar, I was like, I got to stop watching Dave Attell. And I said it like a confessional. And I thought she was going to be like, you're not a real comic then. Everyone watches Attell. And she goes, good. Like, more people should stop watching Dave Attell. Like, people are just ripping him off. And I understand why. But
I think this goes to show just how dominant of a comedic force that Dave Attell was and continues to be. New York City has the greatest comedians in the world. Sorry, Joe Rogan, but the real killers are in New York City, not fucking Austin, Texas. And if all of them are trying to be Dave Attell, what the fuck does that tell you? Not to mention, just about every comedian on the planet today admires Dave Attell and how he's still at the top of his comedy game at 60 years old. Whether they're in New York City, Los Angeles, Austin, or somewhere in between, everybody has a unique admiration for Dave Attell. I talked to Sam Talent after he performed in my town, and he believes that Dave Attell is the greatest stand-up comic of all time. By the way, if you haven't seen Sam Talent, please watch him live if you have the chance. He's a fucking monster. Another clip of someone explaining the genius and influence in comedy that Dave Attell has is Mark Norman on the Lex Friedman podcast. So Dave Attell has made it in his own regard. He can sell out comedy clubs across the country. He's got the best writing and delivery in the world, and if he ever wanted to, he could utilize social media and probably propel his career into the stratosphere, but he stays in New York City and just keeps his world small, and I have all the respect in the world for him doing that. After Insomniac and other projects, Dave Attell chooses to stay where he is right now and just continue to get better at comedy each year in New York City. Also, Hot Cross Buns was a damn masterpiece, and even though it was only 40 minutes, I'd rather watch that than a shitty hour-long special from somebody half as talented. All of this and more is why I made Dave Attell number 7 on the list. Long live Dave Attell. At number 6, we have Rodney Dangerfield. From one line to the next, Rodney Dangerfield was hilarious at any given moment in time. Rodney had this unique aura about him where it really seemed like he didn't give a fuck. Because he didn't. Rodney had this bitterness about him also that contributed to his masterful comedic delivery and sharply written jokes. Rodney started his career in comedy at a young age, but it didn't really take off until much later in his life when he started headlining his own comedy shows in Las Vegas and started making frequent appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. Rodney made it as a comedian and actor so late in life that this would end up being something he talked about. He got no respect, or so he told us, because Rodney consistently received a lot of respect from fellow comedians. Norm Macdonald, for example, absolutely loved Rodney Dangerfield. He has said on numerous occasions that he thinks Rodney is one of the funniest men to ever live. And if Norm Macdonald says somebody is funny, that should be enough praise to put this guy in the top 10. But he also influenced a plethora of different comedians working nowadays, including Jerry Seinfeld, Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, and many, many more. He even had a legendary comedy club named Dangerfields, which helped comedians launch their own comedy careers by shooting HBO specials there like Jim Carrey, Roseanne Barr, Tim Allen, and many more. His relentless one-liner style of comedy was just so addicting to listen to, and so many comedians would go on to adopt a similar style of vicious one-liners one after the other. There's so many great appearances of Rodney Dangerfield on The Tonight Show as well that you have to go see just how goddamn funny Rodney was. Even after his death, he still has had a profound impact on the world of comedy with the legacy he left behind. Something that'll always make me laugh is this hilarious story about Rodney Dangerfield that Norm Macdonald tells.
Well, I met him on Saturday Night Live when I did Update. He came and did some jokes on his 75th birthday. So we have to do dress first at 8:30 and then at 11:30 the show, you know?
Right.
So he comes and he's like, hey, Norm, I got to fucking talk to you, you know? So I go in and I'm like, Mr. Dangerfield, it's great to meet you. That's the first time I ever met him. He goes, listen, man. He goes, what the fuck, man? Why am I doing it at 8:30, you know? I know my fucking jokes. I'll just come back at 11:30. I go, I don't know how it works, Rodney. You got to do it. He goes, God damn. He goes, let me tell you something, kid. He goes, this fucking TV shit, you know? He goes, this waiting around all the fucking time. It's a bunch of all shit, you know? It's shit. He goes, it's the same with fucking movies, you know? You're in the movie, and then you're in the fucking trailer all the time. That's all you're doing is fucking jerking off in the trailer, you know? He goes, it's all shit, kid. He goes, remember this and remember it. Remember it forever. Stand up, man. That's all there is. Stand up.
And he meant it.
Then there's a fucking 5-minute pause. He's looking me right in the eyes. He goes, stand up shit.
He forgot.
Even though Dangerfield's comedy club is now closed after COVID, there will always be a little bit of Rodney's bitterness in all of us. This is why I ranked Rodney at number 6. Long live Rodney Dangerfield.
I'm like an R-A-P-E-R, got so many essays.
At number 5, we have the very controversial Bill Cosby. Now I know this one is going to ruffle some feathers, but we need to talk about the influence of Bill Cosby. Bill has influenced a lot of people. Not his comedy, but how he was as a man. I already know what you guys are going to say about this hypocrite, and you're right. Bill Cosby has done some absolutely deplorable and unforgivable things. This is factual. But I think it would be unfair to discount how many comedians he has influenced and also just how funny he was when he was in his comedy prime. I used to have an amazing Bill Cosby story myself, but now it's not even in the top 10,000. No, but seriously, I think we can separate the art from the artist here and acknowledge that Bill Cosby really impacted a lot of comedians who came up in the late 20th century. Bill Cosby started comedy in California in 1961 and quickly became a favorite of many because of his conversational style of observational comedy on stage. When you see someone doing comedy and almost creating a dialogue between themselves loves in the audience, you can thank Bill Cosby as one of the early pioneers of this style of comedy. Eddie Murphy has a famous story about him and his special Delirious, but he also influenced Richard Pryor, Dave Chappelle, Bill Burr, Louis C.K., Patrice O'Neal, Norm Macdonald, and so many more comedians to come. He had The Cosby Show and a very influential special titled Bill Cosby himself that was ranked as one of the best comedy specials ever released. Rolling Stone ranked this special at number 8 on their list of the 25 greatest stand-up comedy specials of all time. They also ended up ranking him number 8 on the best comedians of all time list they made as well. While I wouldn't put Bill Cosby in my top 20, I acknowledge just how important he was for his time. One thing that also made Bill Cosby stand out was just how clean his comedy was, which was very unexpected when you consider his peers and contemporaries like Richard Pryor or George Carlin, who were well known for being quite filthy, especially as their comedic voices developed later in their career. Then Bill Cosby decided to stop doing stand-up comedy in the 2010s for some reason. I don't know why, but it's a damn shame because Bill Cosby, despite his extracurricular activities, was easily one of the most influential comedians to ever live during his era. Anytime you watch Bill Burr, Patrice O'Neal, Eddie Murphy, or any other controversial type of comedian and you enjoy it, some part of you deep down has to thank Bill Cosby for having such a profound impact and influence on them. Anyway, as a comedian, Bill Cosby is very unique, but as a person, he is completely and morally bankrupt. Even though I detest him as a human being, his influence cannot be denied in the world of stand-up, which is why I ranked him at number 5, but aside from all of that, fuck Bill Cosby. At number 4, we have Lenny Bruce. Lenny's style of comedy really isn't for me at all, but I acknowledge the fact that Lenny Bruce crawled so George Carlin and Richard Pryor could walk as comedians. Lenny Bruce was one of the first comedians to be arrested on stage and charged with violation of obscenity laws, which we all know is a bunch of horseshit. If you're going out to see a comedy show, you might hear some filthy, dirty words that you wouldn't hear when watching fucking Blue's Clues, you know? Lenny did not let the arrests break his spirits either. In fact, he leaned into them because it led to more people finding out about him and his crusade in the world of comedy, which also led to more people receiving his message and what he stood for as an artist. A classic case of the Streisand effect, where somebody says something someone doesn't like and the other person tries to censor them, and instead of receiving less attention, it leads to more people finding out about the situation because of the person's attempt to control the narrative about the situation. Lenny has a famous arrest story that I've covered on this channel where he was taken off stage right in the middle of a bit, and you can actually hear a recording of it on YouTube for yourself. I covered this night in great detail and how George Carlin also ended up getting arrested and taken to jail the same night in the same cop car as Lenny Bruce. As much as I've tried to listen to Lenny Bruce's comedy, I was never able to laugh hard at any of his bits. I couldn't get into him, but the fact that he paved the way for George Carlin, Eddie Murphy, and Richard Pryor to have the massive and successful careers they did while riding the wave of the counterculture movement is enough to make me understand how important his body of work and his time as a comedian really was. Even though he would end up dying at a young age, his name certainly isn't forgotten by anybody who is in the know in the world of comedy. This is why I put Lenny Bruce at number 4 despite not finding him super funny. Long live Lenny Bruce. At number 3, we have Louis C.K. I would describe Louis C.K. as a modern-day George Carlin without the bitterness and self-righteousness. Well, maybe just a little bit of the bitterness. Some comedians like Dave Chappelle have followed George Carlin's model a little bit, where they start out as comedians and eventually morph into more of a social commentator with a sense of humor. But even in Louis C.K.'s old age, he is still trying to write about any and everything he can, and with no shortage of great jokes. I saw Louis C.K. live last week because he's currently touring and building a new hour, and even though he's 57 years old, goodness gracious, he's never been funnier. He's still sharp as a tack and as hilarious as ever on stage, and it's interesting to see him flesh out a new hour of comedy. When you watch Louis, you learn very quickly that you're literally watching a master of their craft at work, and it's fascinating to see. I'll tone down the glazing just a little bit to say that Louis C.K. is another comedian who is commonly cited as one of the biggest influences to young and up-and-coming comedians comedians. Some of the comedians who've cited Louis as an influence, just to name a few, are Shane Gillis, Mark Norman, Tom Segura, Ari Shaffir, Sam Morril, Andrew Schulz, and so many fucking more. Even though the smaller world of comedy isn't relevant, anytime you go to an open mic or show, you can also see some type of influence from Louis C.K. in just about everybody's comedy. I think every comedian at some point has emulated Louis C.K. to a degree. Louis' show also romanticized the idea of what it's like living life as a comedian and some of the high and low moments that come along with trying to make everyday life and its oddities funny on stage in front of a bunch of people who experience the same exact oddities in their own unique way. Louis has also released a tremendous body of work that has undoubtedly been heard by comedy fans millions and millions of times and has helped inspire a new generation of comedians. Comedy specials like Shameless, Chewed Up, and Live at the Beacon Theater are masterclasses in how to be funny and make light out of any dark or weird thing you experience in your everyday life. Louis also brought a lot of the darkest and most surreal moments of the human experience to the stage, and as cringe as it may sound, he also pushed the boundaries of what is often acceptable in the world of comedy. There's no shortage of clips out there of comedians praising Louis C.K., but similar to Dave Attell, I really think just about every New York City comedian, probably just about every comedian in the world, has taken a bit of influence from Louis C.K. and his cerebral approach to observational comedy. With all of the work he's put into his own comedy, and all of the great comedians working nowadays who cite him as an influence, I think putting Louis C.K. as number 3 is a well-earned spot for him, and I wish a healthy life to our favorite comedian slash masturbator. Long live Louis C.K.
Want me to stay at ease? Fuck you and your corporation. Y'all niggas can't control me.
At number 2, we have Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor is undoubtedly one of the greatest comedians of all time, and the list of comedians he has influenced is long and distinguished. Richard Pryor is not only beloved by a lot of old school comedy fans, but is also universally respected by just about every new comedian on the planet. He actually has one of the highest grossing specials of all time, which was his Live at the Sunset Strip comedy special he filmed after he set himself on fire while freebasing cocaine. Richard Pryor was a comedian at the Comedy Store that every new paid regular wanted to be just like, because it seemed like anything he talked about was just automatically hilarious just because of the way he talked. Even though Richard Pryor is not in my top 10 personal funniest comedians, he has a special place in my heart because he's my father's favorite comedian, and he always told me the reason he loved Richard was because he would talk about uncomfortable truths and situations that a lot of people were much too shy to talk about. Wise words from my dad. George Carlin would do a similar thing to Richard, and that's part of the reason these two guys rode the wave of the counterculture movement so hard and so righteously. A lot of TV was sanitized and squeaky clean, but some people were tired of that and wanted some comedy full of shit and pussy jokes. And good God almighty, if you wanted that, Richard Pryor was your guy. The elephant in the room is that Richard Pryor was a black comedian and came up during an era in American history where racial tensions were still very present. Not to mention, he was one of the most famous black comedians in the world at a time when it wasn't super common to see black comedians. He carried the torch for so many and influenced some of the greatest comedians to ever live, including Eddie Murphy, Louis C.K., Bill Burr, Norm Macdonald, Dave Chappelle, Chris Rock, and many, many more. If I listed everyone that Richard Pryor influenced and impacted in the world of comedy, this video would be even longer than it already is. Between George and Richard, in my opinion, Richard Pryor was funnier, but just about anything great that happens in the world of comedy nowadays can be traced back to one of these two comedic geniuses. The two of them transcended comedy itself, and I'm incredibly thankful their legacies exist and have helped inspire and influence some of the greatest comedians working today and some of the best up-and-coming comics that are still working on breaking through to the mainstream. All in all, Richard Pryor's stand-up was a force to be reckoned with, and I believe he more than deserves number 2 on the list. Long live Richard Pryor. Now let's get to number 1.
Rat shit, dirty old twat. 69 assholes tied in a knot.
At number 1, the most influential comedian of all time, we have George Carlin. I know some of you might not agree with this, and I understand, but I think George Carlin and Richard Pryor have had the biggest impact on stand-up comedy as a whole. If you're a fan of this channel, you would know I actually did not put George Carlin in my top 10 funniest comedians of all time list because personally, I don't find him funnier than any of the comedians I listed in my video. But that doesn't mean I don't find him funny at all or recognize his importance to stand-up comedy comedy as a genre. I know we generally laugh at the idea of important comedy on this channel, but for his time, George Carlin was a comedic genius who represented the counterculture in a time when progressive ideas were not welcomed by mainstream television and show business. Early on in George's career, he wore a suit and did the hippy-dippy weatherman while making a fuckload of money. But he knew deep down this wasn't who he was, so he started dressing like a hippie and making a fraction of the money. It didn't pay as well, but this is who George Carlin truly was deep down, and he trusted this path of dissonance until he became one of the most accomplished and greatest comedians of all time. While he wasn't in my top 10, I still find him super funny and would definitely put him in my top 20 funniest comedians of all time. I didn't grow up with George Carlin, but I do know that just about every single comedian of the modern era cites him as a comedic influence and a pillar of observational comedy as well as the art form in general, whether it be Jerry Seinfeld, Jon Stewart, Patrice O'Neal, Bill Burr, Louis C.K., Chris Rock, Mitch Hedberg, or just about any other prominent comedian you can think of. They have more than likely cited George as a huge inspiration in their comedic journey and paid homage to him in every possible way. Even if you don't like George Carlin and you don't find him funny, it would be incredibly disingenuous to pretend he did not have a massive impact on stand-up comedy. He was a counterculture icon during a period where comedians were literally getting arrested on stage for telling jokes. In fact, he himself was pulled off stage many times for performing jokes deemed inappropriate by officials. The man even has a historic Supreme Court case based on his 7 dirty words routine. The FCC made this man a part of American history, all because he told some inappropriate jokes. It's a far cry from the world of comedy we have today, where some comedians worry about cancel culture more than they worry about actually being funny. I firmly believe in my heart that George Carlin and Richard Pryor are the 2 most influential comedians to ever walk the earth, and I hope you can understand why I ranked my list this way with George Carlin as number 1. Long live the late great George Carlin. In conclusion, this is my list of the most influential comedians of all time. Some of them are old heads who are no longer with us, while some of them are grizzled veterans of the comedy universe that are praised by the younger generation nowadays. We might not be able to always agree on what and who we think is the funniest, because what we find funny varies from person to person, but I think that the comedians who are the most influential and have impacted comedy as a whole are slightly more objectively measured than the former. While I don't think I would ever find George Carlin funnier than Louis C.K., Norm Macdonald, or Dave Attell, I still acknowledge him as a monumental figure in the world of comedy and its trajectory over the last century. Same with Lenny Bruce. I got some heat for not including George Carlin or Richard Pryor in my top 10 funniest comedians list, and I acknowledged my bias and conceded that if I grew up with them, I would have probably ranked them higher. However, I just don't find them as funny as the people I ranked in my top 10 list. But anyway, what do you guys think? Do you agree with my list of the most influential comedians? Do you disagree with it? What comedians did I miss that you think I should have included? Or what comedians did I include that you think should not have been listed? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you guys love my videos and want to support me more, you can check out my Patreon page. All of that money goes directly towards me making better videos. Also, I put some bonus content on there and upload a few new videos a month that have to do with a lot of other stuff in my personal life. Thank you for all the likes, comments, and subscribes. Your support does not go unnoticed. Other than that, that's all I got for you today. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.